The first Rangdan xenocide and the Battle of Advex-Mors. Of all the campaigns waged by the First Legion, it is their battles against the Rangdan that have most intrigued historians and scholars, for the veil of secrecy cast over these engagements has served only to make the myths that have taken the place of truth all the more grand. There is little information to be found outside of the most carefully guarded sections of the Imperial archives, and the records of the Dark Angels themselves, a legion well known for rigorously maintaining its many secrets. However, for the first of the great wars against the Rangdan, there is another source of information available to us, the data cores of the rebel forge world of Xana II, raided and burned by loyalist forces during the Great Scouring. Before its dark magi fled into exile, much information was recovered from the forge world that the First Legion could not seal away. It is from these meticulously gathered scraps of knowledge that a true picture of the first battle between the Dark Angels and the Rangdan can be formed. The First Legion gathered a mighty armada for the assault on the world of Advex-Mors, some 50,000 warriors of the First Legion and another 100,000 support troops drawn from both Imperial Army regiments and Mechanicum Tagmata forces from nearby Xana, as well as near a full 100 capital-class starships and many times that of smaller escort craft. At that time, this was a fearsome force of arms, but one still reckoned lacking by many for the task they had set themselves. The initial reports from the 5th Legion fleet that had made the first charts of Advex-Mors painted a grim picture for the assault force, for the 6th world of the Advex-Mors system were heavily fortified and garrisoned, so much so that the strategos of the Divisio Militaris would initially believe this, erroneously, to be the seat of the Rangdan's power in our galaxy, rather than the isolated outpost it was later found to be. Vast legions of captured humans and other more exotic breeds of slave awaited the Imperial attackers, slave soldiers bound to their Rangdan masters by cruel neural collars that enforced absolute loyalty and reduced them to little more than savage drones to the Xenos that commanded them. The Rangdan themselves possessed many horrific weapons, the product of a vile technology created solely for destruction and subjugation, the ultimate expression of which was the vast war moon that sat in orbit of Advex-Mors Primus. This immense engine of war could match the firepower of a full fleet of starships and bore armor capable of shrugging off strikes from capital-scale weaponry. It would prove the greatest obstacle to the invasion and the most terrible symbol of the Rangdan's power and malevolent ingenuity. The First Legion, led by their new Grand Master Urian Vendraig, welcomed the challenge presented them. Indeed, to succeed in the face of overwhelming odds and prove the valor of his legion was one of the core goals Vendraig had assigned the campaign, a return to glory for the First Legion. In honor of this goal, the fighting began in grand style as the assembled Imperial fleet tore an opening in the fabric of space to translate into Advex-Mors a single wedge of steel and guns. This feat of navigation, impressive in its own right, was overshadowed by the sheer might of the fleet assembled, with the leading squadron comprising no less than 3 Gloriana-class battleships, the Invincible Reason, the Paradigm of Hate, and the Truce Razor. Those few scattered squadrons of Rangdan warp barks able to oppose the sudden appearance of the Imperium's fleet were quickly swept aside by the sheer strength of the First Legion's gathered ships. Even the foul weaponry of the Rangdan Voidcraft and apathetic bravery of the neural thralls that crewed them could not slow the Imperium's advance. though the complex electromagnetic weapons employed by those ships, often called shadow blasters by the naval crews for the ominous shadows left behind by their atomized victims, left many crewmen crippled by radiation sickness. The invasion of Advex-Mors extremis followed these initial successes in orbit, with the Grand Master himself deploying at the head of the First Legion's 8th chapter to spearhead the assault. Advex Extremis possessed only limited strategic worth, playing host to a small facility that refined fuel from the vast seas of liquid hydrogen trapped beneath the thick icy crust, and was defended by only a small garrison of slave soldiers and a single Rangdan overseer. Yet despite this, its value to the morale of the invasion force and as a statement of the First Legion's power was immense. 1,000 warriors of the First Legion took to the field against 10,000 of the foe, a frenzied wave of flesh puppets sent by their Xenos overlord into a mindless fury to spend their lives recklessly that the foe might be crushed. The dark wave of mind-slaved warriors washed over the First Legion's lines and was shattered and broken by the Legiones Astartes in a battle that lasted but 3 short solar hours, at a cost to them of less than 200 casualties. Urian Vendrake himself descended into the boreal hell of the ice mines and slew the Rangdan overlord in personal combat, emerging to hoist its head before the assembled warriors of his legion. This is how the fighting went on the 4 outer worlds, each small garrison isolated by the vast Imperial fleet and destroyed in detail by different detachments of the First Legion, each testing and probing the foe for weaknesses. The Rangdan spent the lives of their slaves profligately to bleed the Legion, sending tens of thousands to their deaths to slow their advance and cull the numbers of the invaders, losing but a handful of true Rangdan as the First Legion celebrated their victories. Within the space of a few short solar months, the Imperium's fleet had crushed the 4 outermost planets of the system and stood upon the threshold of Advex-Mors Primus. Here would begin the true battle. For, as the First Legion had spent its time subjugating the outer worlds, the Rangdan had gathered all their strength amongst the huge, shielded fortresses of Advex-Mors Primus, and in its skies hung the vast war moon, a sentinel of huge and terrifying power. Here there would be no simple triumph, and the First Legion turned to a far more daring plan to secure victory. Knowing that any effort to destroy the war moon by means of a sustained orbital assault would result in massive casualties and allow the planet beneath even more time to fortify and prepare, Grandmaster Vendrake planned to strike both targets at once, using the might of his Astartes warriors. A single chapter of the Legion would attack the war moon under cover of a diversionary attack by the fleet and disable it from within, while the majority of the Legion would conduct a massive planetary landing and crush the world's capital in a single, focused assault. The phalanx of heavy Imperial battleships advanced on Advex-Mors Primus, but unlike previous engagements, the lumpen Xenos defense barges did not rush headlong to meet them and be torn apart by the heavy guns of the First Legion. Instead, the Rangdan craft formed a defensive constellation about the war moon, denying the Imperial fleet any easy opening by which to deploy landing craft or make a concerted assault, and displaying a level of tactical awareness hitherto unexpected by the Emperor's forces, who were now forced to attack into the concentrated guns of the foe. The space around Rangdan erupted in light as the 2 fleets clashed above the immense face of the war moon, and hundreds of thousands of guns let fly, punctuating the void with both the yellow flash of Imperial macro cannons and the malefic green flare of Rangdan shadow blasters. Within the first few moments, Both fleets had lost entire squadrons of craft, with concentrated weapons fire from the innumerable guns of the War Moon ripping apart even the most heavily shielded of Imperium voidcraft and spreading storms of debris across the battle zone. This was a war of attrition the Imperium's forces had wanted to avoid and could ill afford to prolong, but one they could not easily abandon without ceding control of Advex-Mors Primus to the enemy. It would only be the sacrifice of the battleship Paradigm of Hate that would finally turn the tide of the engagement. The ancient battleship, its void shields flaring as it strove to absorb the sheer weight of fire thrown at it, plowed into the enemy's formation and scattered the lesser ships of the Rangdan. Infested by Rangdan's stalker drones and badly wounded by the exotic directed energy weapons of the Xenos craft, the Paradigm of Hate slammed into the vast hull of the War Moon, gouging a deep wound in its metal hide. The survivors of its crew and the contingent of 1st Legion warriors aboard the battleship took up defensive positions within the shattered wreck of their vessel and set the plasma reactor to reach catastrophic overload, even as the Rangdan hosts aboard the vast War Moon moved to overwhelm them. A brief and bloody action was fought in the cold void on the War Moon's surface, with full detachments of towering Rangdan warriors committed to battle for the first time. Brutally strong and armed with weapons of terrible power, the Rangdan proved a match for the Legiones Astartes, both sides inflicting serious casualties upon their foe, but the Rangdan could not overrun the 1st Legion's defenses in time to prevent the Paradigm of Hate's vengeance. The warriors that had once rowed the proud ship into war sacrificed themselves that she might strike one last blow against the foe, her reactors exploding like a miniature sun, crippling the vast War Moon and spreading a deadly storm of debris across high orbit. With its death, the battleship had brought the rest of the fleet a brief respite, a chance to press the foe, and the orbital battle quickly fell into a chaotic melee of intermixed starships and squadrons, each locked in a desperate struggle for survival in a mass of duels between individuals and squadrons. The remaining Imperial battleships, Invincible Reason, Truce Razor, blasted a path into low orbit, weathering enemy attack craft and strikes from ground-based weapons platforms to begin landing ground forces, abandoning any attempt to capture the shattered and silent War Moon. As the sky filled with the light of 1,000 tiny battles fought in the void, the massed forces of the 1st Legion made planetfall, a rain of drop pods falling on the wastelands away from the chain of fortresses that girded the equator, while several smaller forces dispersed in squadrons of gunships and Stormbird transports. It would be these smaller forces that saw action first, mounting raids on the nearest fortresses and those columns of Rangdan slave soldiers sent to investigate the landing zone, buying time with the blood of the enemy for their brothers to array themselves for battle. For the first day, these raiding columns, mostly led by the warriors of the Order of Crows and the marshals of the hosts of wind and fire, bore the brunt of the fighting. At first, they only had to contend with lesser forces of slave soldiers, driven into their path by the Rangdan to weaken them and easily bested by the battle-hardened Legiones Astartes. But they would also be the first to face the true Rangdan in combat. Little is known of the alien enemy those warriors faced, that they were towering creatures of fell strength, inhuman cunning, and bearing the products of a cruel technology that equaled or even exceeded that of mankind is common to all tales that would later be told. The warriors that fought these initial battles suffered terribly, many of the columns reduced to less than half their original strength as they fended off the Rangdan, and several were annihilated entirely. But the information they procured was priceless indeed. The tactics, weaponry, and character of the Rangdan were laid bare to Grandmaster Vendraig, though at the cost of several hundred of his finest warriors. With this, he planned his next steps. Arrayed and ordered to take full advantage of their foe's weakness, the host of the First Legion advanced in force to meet their enemy. A host of near 30,000 Astartes in full panoply of glory, and with all the brutal weapons of their trade, the full muster of those still combat capable and not bound to serve in orbit aboard the ships of the fleet. Such a force was a threat that could not be ignored, and the Rangdan, proud and still certain of their superiority, quickly moved to oppose the creatures that dared to invade their home. The two armies met across 100 kilometers of Advex-Mors' broken outlands. The initial stages of the battle were fought against the slave legions of the Rangdan by the screening elements of the host of blades and the heavy tanks of the host of iron, warriors ready to counter this by now a familiar Rangdan tactic. Knowing that the true Rangdan would expend their slaves with abandon in order to pinpoint a weakness in the Astartes' lines before attacking, pitting their strength against the weakest point of their opponent, Grandmaster Vendraig had massed his finest warriors, veterans of the hosts of crowns and bone, to act as a mobile reserve. Meanwhile, mobile elements of companies led by warriors of the host of wind, mounted on swift jet bikes and land speeders, isolated and harried the main body of the Rangdan force and relayed precise information on their movements. Made complacent by Tehran's centuries of conquest and success, the Rangdan elite watched and waited, fully assured that they would claim victory once committed to the fighting against an exhausted and drained foe. Rather than wait for the hammer blow to fall and sunder his formation, Grandmaster Vendraig moved first, leading a charge that burst through the slave soldier battalions and bore down upon their waiting Rangdan overlords. Too proud to retreat in the face of such a challenge, the Rangdan met the warriors of the First Legion blade to blade in a savage melee that tested the mettle of both forces. The stoic brutality and measured swordsmanship of the First Legion matched against the savage might and cruel technology of the Rangdan. Legiones Astartes warriors were cut asunder by Rangdan warriors, enveloped in layers of energy shielding that burned the very air about them as they fought, while the lithe, vulpine Xenos fell before the tyrannic greatswords of the First Legion Terminators. It was a slaughter that would have ended in mutual annihilation, both sides equally matched in skill and power, until Vendraig met the Rangdan Warmaster in single combat. Vendraig was a superlative swordsman, strong of arm and swift in battle, yet his foe was a towering Xenos monster, cloaked in burning energy fields and wielding a huge crystalline blade that bled a neurotoxin of hideous potency. For an hour the duel raged, and as their warriors died around them, the two generals fought with savage ferocity, neither giving an inch. In the end, though racked by the pain of the toxin raging in his blood and his armor rent and sundered, Urian Vendraig slew his foe and held high the severed head of the Rangdan Warmaster. The battle decided, and the pride of that foul Xenos breed broken. With the greatest strength of the foe shattered in open combat by the warriors of the Emperor and their Warmaster a cooling corpse in the dust, those Rangdan that remained fled and took refuge in the fortresses left to them. However, with the Imperium ships consolidating control of orbit, now that the War Moon had been broken, and the Grand Master's host having scattered the greatest strength of their defenses, the Rangdan were a broken force. The next few solar months became a series of grueling sieges, as the First Legion surrounded and reduced each of the Rangdan fortresses by storm, leaving no stone upon stone and utterly erasing all trace of the enemy on the world they had once claimed. While in orbit, specially equipped counters of breaches and destroyers swept the vast ruins of the War Moon, slaughtering the thousands of Rangdan still trapped in its labyrinthine warrens. Yet the cost of this victory in the first Rangdan xenocide was staggering, for some 10,000 of the First Legion slain and 50 Imperial ships of the line utterly destroyed, including the irreplaceable Paradigm of Hate, the wreckage of which could not be salvaged from the fused remains of the Rangdan War Moon. This was the legacy the First Legion wished to leave, a symbol of their legion in the barren waste they made of Advex-Mors, and a message to those who might seek to oppose them. Those that would seek war with the First Legion would be met by a foe that would not balk when faced with the highest cost to claim victory, a host that would bring an enemy not only to defeat, but to utter annihilation.